Why did the room fall silent the moment her eyes lifted from the map? No one had the answer. Maybe it was the way her gaze lingered too long on the red line across hostile ground, the way her pupils seemed to hold a reflection no one else could see. Maybe it was the stillness in her posture, a rigidness that looked almost brittle. Weakness, some thought, hesitation, fragility wrapped in a uniform too heavy for her shoulders. But she never corrected them, let them assume, let them whisper. Because silence was safer than truth. Silence kept the storms hidden, and silence, though they couldn't understand, was her sharpest weapon. The hum of the projector droned over the long oak table. Dust floated through the beam of light, turning the air thick and heavy. Faded maps curled at the edges, covered with fresh ink, markers circling danger zones. Radios hissed and clicked from the corner. Outside, helicopter rotors beat against the dusk, waiting for orders like caged animals straining at the leash. Inside, the air smelled of coffee gone cold, and sweat trapped in fatigues worn too long. The commander's voice broke the monotony, stern, sharp, testing. "Lieutenant, your route, explain it." She lifted her pen, the metal tip hovering over the map. The room's weight pressed down on her shoulders, but her tone stayed even. "We move through elevation, delayed flank. South Bend covers our rear. If contact pushes harder than expected, we cut them blind before they regroup." Silence spread. Her pen clicked once against the table. A scoff rose from across the room. One of the veterans, his face carved by years of dust and loss, his arms crossed like a wall of dismissal. He didn't need words to show what he thought of her. Still, he added them anyway. "Too cautious. We don't have the luxury of fear." The word hung, fear. She met his eyes for a second, steady, controlled. They thought that pause between her sentences was weakness. They thought her silence was hesitation. They didn't know it was the sound of memory pressing against her throat. She drew in a breath, soft, almost invisible, and replied, "Speed is reckless. Speed gets us killed before we see the crosshairs. Caution gets us out alive." The commander studied her, a stillness in his jaw, a test unspoken. Seconds passed. Finally, a short nod. He moved on. No approval, no recognition, just the weight of responsibility passed on like a stone. Around the table, chatter resumed. Strategy, numbers, contingencies, but for her, the sound dulled into background noise. She traced the lines again, her finger brushing the southern bend of the route. That bend meant everything. That bend was where her sister's convoy had been ambushed 2 years ago. The others didn't know. They didn't know that she had stared at this terrain before, not on a screen, not in a briefing, but in a morgue photo, a blurred image of wreckage and dust. Her sister's name etched into a report that said "missing in action." No body returned. Just an empty coffin lowered into earth while their father stood stiff, jaw locked, refusing to cry. The pen trembled in her hand just for a second. She set it down. Her silence in the briefing room wasn't fear, it was weight. And weight, carried long enough, became armor. That night, under the heavy canvas of her tent, the base pulsed with restless life. Boots scraped gravel, radios hissed with clipped voices. Cigarettes burned in shadows, tiny sparks against the desert dark. Generators droned, coughing bursts of light into the night air. She sat apart, alone with her weapon spread across the table. The rifle gleamed in the dim bulb overhead. Piece by piece, she cleaned it, her hands steady except when they were. When the memories pushed through and her fingers curled tighter than they should. She pressed her palm over the chest pocket of her fatigues, felt the folded paper there, the letter. Edges worn, ink smudged from rain the day of the funeral. Her sister's handwriting, looping and alive, speaking encouragement that no longer had a voice behind it. She read it every night before a mission. Sometimes the words brought strength. Sometimes they tore her open. Tonight they did both. Her sister's laugh came back to her, as sharp as it had been in their kitchen at home, before the war stole everything soft. That laugh, bright, fearless, echoed until it became a ghost. It followed her through silence, through dreams, through the aching spaces between orders. The outpost they were about to breach was not just another mission. Not for her. It was the same network that had orchestrated the ambush, the same shadows that swallowed her sister whole. And she hadn't told anyone that. Not the commander, not her squad, not the men who thought silence was weakness. Because if they knew, if they even suspected, they would take her off the op. Say she was compromised. Say she couldn't be trusted to separate vengeance from duty. But they didn't know, and they wouldn't. The desert wind clawed at the tent walls, snapping the canvas like restless spirits outside. She worked the rifle until her reflection stared back at her from the metal. She whispered into the dark, 3 words no one would ever hear them. Not again, never. The bulb flickered, shadows stretched, voices drifted from nearby tents, men trading jokes too loud, laughter too thin, a mask to cover nerves. She heard someone mention a daughter back home, a birthday he would miss again. Another muttered about bad dreams, how his hands shook when the guns went quiet. These small truths, heavy as the silence she carried. Humanity bleeding through uniforms. Her humanity lived in silence, in the words she didn't say, in the storm she kept locked behind her eyes. She lay back on the cot, boots still on, rifle resting within reach. The night pressed in. Sleep came slow, dragging her through memories instead of dreams. She saw her sister's convoy again, dust rising in the desert. A sudden crack, then fire, smoke thick enough to choke. A radio call cut short, screams swallowed in static. Then silence. Always silence. She jolted awake, chest heaving. The bass still buzzed, indifferent. No one noticed. She wiped sweat from her forehead, sat up, stared at the dim shape of her rifle. Dawn crept over the desert, pale light seeping into shadows, painting the world in muted colors. Soon, orders would be given. Engines would roar. Boots would move in rhythm. And she would walk into the storm, carrying her silence like a blade. They would see weakness in her eyes, fragility, hesitation. But what they would never see, what they could never know, was that courage often looked like weakness. That silence could scream louder than any battle cry. Her courage was not pride, it was sacrifice. And when the mission began, that sacrifice would guide every step she took. The letter pressed against her chest, the memory pressed against her heart, and the storm inside her waited for release. Why did she pause at the helicopter door? The others didn't notice. They were too busy shouting over the engine noise, checking straps, slapping shoulders. Like this was another routine ride into another patch of desert no one cared about. But she hesitated, just long enough for the cold dawn air to bite at her skin, just long enough for her hand to grip the edge of the doorframe tighter than it should. Her silence was invisible in the storm of sound, rotors chopping, metal rattling, voices drowned in thunder. But inside her pulse pounded. Not fear, not exactly. Something else. Something she could never name out loud. She stepped in, sat down, locked the harness. The soldier across from her smirked, shaking his head as if to say, nervous rookie. He'd seen it before. That look. That pause, the small tremor that gave away doubt. He didn't know the truth. She wasn't nervous because of what lay ahead. She was nervous because of what she carried with her. The letter pressed against her chest. The memory pressed harder. The helicopter lifted. The base shrank into a blur of concrete and canvas. Wind roared through the cabin. Dust filled the air until the world outside became nothing but a pale smear of horizon. She kept her eyes forward, silent, watching, listening. Around her, the squad filled the space with noise, banter, forced laughter, fragments of bravado that masked the same knot in every stomach. One man tapped the magazine of his rifle against his knee, rhythmic, like a prayer he didn't know he was saying. Another mouthed words she couldn't hear, lips moving like he was talking to someone who wasn't there. Beside her, Corporal Mason leaned close. His voice cut through the storm just enough for her to catch it. First op with us, huh? She nodded once. Don't worry. Nerves go away after the first bullet flies. You'll forget the fear real quick. She almost smiled. Almost, because he was wrong. Fear never left, not the real kind. It lived inside, disguised, silent. It sat in the chest like a stone. You didn't forget it, you carried it. She wanted to say that. She wanted to tell him that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the act of moving through it, carrying it, bearing its weight when it became unbearable. But she didn't. She just nodded again, lips pressed shut. Mason studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged, leaning back against the vibrating wall of the chopper. Silence was easier than explaining. The desert stretched endless below, a sea of dust and broken rock. The sun clawed its way over the horizon, bleeding red into the pale sky. Heat waves shimmered even in the early light. From above, the land looked dead. But she knew better. She knew shadows lived there, watching, waiting. The commander's voice crackled over the headset, sharp and distant. 30 minutes to drop. Her chest tightened. She let the words settle in. 30 minutes until boots hit ground. 30 minutes until silence became action. 30 minutes until she would walk into the same terrain that had swallowed her sister whole. She closed her eyes. The thrum of the rotors became a heartbeat, heavy, relentless. Her mind drifted, uninvited, to the kitchen back home. Sunlight through the window. Her sister laughing, hair tied back, flour on her hands as she tossed dough into the air with a clumsy grace that made both of them giggle. A sound so alive, so ordinary, it felt impossible to lose. The memory cracked. The laughter twisted into the echo of a radio call cut short. Static, screams, silence. Her eyes snapped open. Not here, not now. She forced the images back, burying them under layers of steel. She couldn't afford to drown in ghosts when the living needed her steady. She scanned the squad, 7 of them in total, each face carrying a story. She didn't know all of them yet, not really. But in moments like this, staring at the lines etched into their skin, the eyes that didn't blink enough, she could guess. Some had families waiting. Some had no one. Some had already left too much of themselves out here in pieces of blood and sand. The man across from her, the one who smirked earlier, caught her gaze again. His eyes narrowed, challenging, like he wanted to remind her she didn't belong, like her silence was proof enough she wasn't cut from their cloth. She looked away. Let him think that, let them all think that, it was safer this way. The helicopter banked suddenly, tilting hard. Bodies shifted, harnesses strained. A ripple of unease ran through the cabin. Her hand went instinctively to her rifle, fingers brushing the cold metal. Comfort. Anchor. Outside, the terrain changed. Jagged ridges rose like broken teeth, shadows clinging to their edges. Valleys cut deep scars into the earth, hiding secrets no satellite could see. Somewhere out there, men waited. Men who had turned her sister into a name on a folded flag. The commander's voice again. Approaching LZ, get ready. Mason grinned at her, a grin too wide to be real. Showtime, Lieutenant. She gave him nothing back, only silence. The helicopter descended. Dust exploded upward, a violent storm that blinded the world outside. The ramp lowered. Heat rushed in, dry and suffocating. Boots unlatched, weapons readied, breaths held. She stood with the others, heart steady now, no hesitation in her steps. They moved into the dust, into the silence. The world outside was chaos. Grit stinging skin, sun blazing without mercy, the sound of rotors fatting as the bird lifted away. Then nothing but the crunch of boots on dry ground and the ringing in her ears. They formed up quickly, moving toward the ridge that marked their first checkpoint. Every step crunched louder than it should, echoing in her mind like a countdown. Her eyes scanned the horizon, searching for movement, a glint of glass, a shadow shifting wrong. The silence here was never just silence. It was alive, breathing, waiting. Mason muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. Feels too quiet. She didn't answer, quiet was her language, but inside she agreed, too quiet. The squad pushed forward, following the map she had traced the night before. The same path she had insisted on in the briefing. The path through elevation, the cautious route, the one they had doubted. Every step deeper felt like walking into her own past. The ridge loomed ahead, sharp against the sky. She led the climb, boots slipping against loose rock, dust filling her throat. Muscles burned, lungs tightened, but she kept moving. At the top she paused, crouched low, scanning. The valley stretched below, a wound carved into the earth. Far in the distance, black smoke curled faintly upward, evidence of fire, of life, of danger. Her stomach knotted, she knew that smell, she knew that sight. Mason came up beside her, panting. "What do you see?" She hesitated, words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him the truth, that this valley was haunted, that it had already taken more than it should, that it carried her sister's ghost in every grain of sand. But instead she said, "Movement, south edge." He lifted his scope, scanned. "Copy that." The squad spread out, weapons ready. The air thickened, tension humming like a wire pulled too tight. And in that silence, in that fragile stillness before the storm, she felt it again. The weight in her chest, the memory pressing hard. They thought her quiet was weakness. They thought the pause in her words was fear. But here on the ridge, staring into the valley that had broken her once before, she knew the truth. Her silence was strength, it had to be. Because the next moments would test every piece of her, mind, body, soul. And she wasn't sure which would break first. What broke the silence first, wind or gunfire? At the ridge, time stretched thin, stretched fragile. Every soldier's breath slowed, waiting for the sound that would decide if this was survival or slaughter. The desert wind hissed across jagged stone, carrying dust into their eyes, into their throats. She crouched low, eyes fixed through the narrow sightline of her rifle. No movement, no figures, just endless rock and sand. Yet the feeling, thick, heavy, clung to her skin. They were not alone. The man behind her shifted his boot against gravel, too loud. The sound cracked like lightning against the silence. She flinched, jaw tight. Her hand tightened on the rifle grip. Then it came, not gunfire, not yet. A whistle, thin, faint, like air slicing around metal. Her instinct screamed, DOWN. The explosion tore the ridge apart. Stone shattered. Dust swallowed the sky. The squad dropped flat as shards of rock sliced the air around them. Her ears rang, deafening, a high-pitched wail that muted shouts into muffled echoes. Her cheek pressed against hot earth, heart pounding, breath ragged. "Mortars!" She lifted her head just enough to see Mason yelling, his lips moving fast, pointing toward the valley. Another whistle, another impact. The ground shook, lifted, fell. This was no random fire. They were bracketed, watched. She rolled, dragging her rifle close, scanning through smoke and chaos. Shapes flickered at the far ridgeline. Tiny sparks of light, muzzle flashes. Then came the storm. Bullets chewed stone inches from her face. She pressed flat again, dirt grinding into her skin. The squad returned fire, deafening cracks echoing across the canyon. Sparks danced off rock, ricochets whining like angry hornets. Her mind screamed with memory, her sister's convoy, the sudden eruption of fire, the radio call breaking into static. She tasted ash. She heard screams. Not again. Her hand steadied, almost against her will. She lifted the rifle, sighted down the scope. The world narrowed. One figure, crest of the far ridge. Rifle rising, she exhaled slow, finger pressed, the shot cracked. The figure folded, dropped. No time to breathe. Another target, another breath, another shot. Her silence was gone now, replaced by the cold rhythm of action. Fire. Adjust. Fire again. The storm around her blurred into muted sound, as if the world had narrowed to just her and the space between beats. Mason's voice cut through faintly. "Good shot, Lieutenant." She didn't respond, she couldn't. The squad pushed forward, crawling through dust, using shattered stone for cover. Bullets rained, carving sparks into the earth. Another mortar whistled overhead, slamming into the ridge behind them, spraying rock like knives. Her pulse stayed steady, too steady. She wondered if this was what her sister had felt before the end, the terrifying calm that came when death was close enough to touch. Then the sudden silence. No more mortars, no more muzzle flashes. The echoes faded into the desert air. Only the ringing in her ears remained. The squad froze, waiting, breaths held. Nothing. The valley returned to stillness, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that carried teeth. The commander's voice crackled faint over the comms. "Squad, report." Mason answered first, his voice hoarse. "We're pinned, took fire from the ridge, no casualties yet, enemy pulled back." Her eyes stayed locked on the far ridge. Empty, but empty didn't mean safe. She forced herself to speak, her voice steadier than she felt. "They were testing us, gauging numbers. That wasn't an ambush, it was a warning." The smirking soldier from before barked a laugh too sharp for the moment. "A warning? Out here? That's cute. They don't warn, Lieutenant, they kill." She ignored him. Because deep down she knew she was right. Something about the attack was wrong, too brief, too controlled. Her sister's ambush had been chaos, relentless. This was different. The commander's voice again clipped. "Hold position, await orders." They dug in against the ridge, setting perimeter, weapons aimed at shadows. The sun climbed higher, baking stone until it burned through gloves. Sweat trickled down faces, stinging eyes. Time slowed again. She sat with her back against the rock, rifle across her lap. Her hands trembled now that the firing had stopped. She clenched them, forcing stillness. Mason dropped beside her, wiping dust from his face. His grin was tired, brittle. "You shoot like you've done this before." She didn't answer. Silence filled the space between them. After a moment he lowered his voice, softer, human. "You got someone back home?" The question pierced deeper than bullets. She froze. For a second she saw her sister's face again. Laughing, alive, then gone. She shook her head. No. It was the truth and a lie. Mason didn't press. He leaned back, eyes closing briefly against the sun. "Lucky you, less to lose." She turned her gaze away, heart tightening. If only he knew. If only any of them knew what she had already lost. The smirking soldier walked past, spitting into the dirt. His voice carried sharp. "Don't get too comfortable, Lieutenant. Next time hesitation'll get us killed." Her jaw clenched. She kept her eyes down, let him think what he wanted. Silence was safer than spilling the truth. Hours dragged. The squad stayed hidden, watching, waiting for orders. The valley below shimmered in heat, deceptively calm. But every gust of wind carried the threat of another whistle, another explosion. She pressed her palm against the folded letter in her pocket. Her sister's words burned against her chest. Words of encouragement, of pride. Words written by someone who hadn't come back. She whispered into the heat, too low for anyone to hear. "I won't fail you." Finally, the commander's voice broke the monotony. "Squad, advance, secure the valley, move cautious, eyes everywhere." They moved. Down the ridge into the wound of the earth. Dust clung to sweat-soaked skin. Every shadow felt like an enemy. Every silence felt like a trap. She walked second in line, rifle raised, eyes cutting the horizon. Each step forward echoed with memory. Each stone beneath her boot felt like the same path her sister's convoy had taken before the desert swallowed it. The squad moved in silence now. No banter, no bravado, just the sound of breath, boots, and weapons shifting. At the valley floor, the air felt heavier, still. Her chest tightened. Something was wrong. She slowed, scanning. Then she saw it, half buried in sand, barely visible, metal charred. She froze. It wasn't just debris. It wasn't just wreckage. It was part of a vehicle, military issue. the same model her sister had been riding in 2 years ago. Her breath caught, knees almost buckled, the world spun for a second. Mason's voice behind her, "Lieutenant, you see something." She forced her body still. Her hand gripped the rifle so tight her knuckles whitened. "Nothing," she whispered. But inside the storm roared. This was no coincidence. This valley wasn't just their mission. It was her past, her loss, her ghost. And she wasn't sure she could carry it much longer in silence. Why did the night feel heavier than any they had endured before? The campfire had burned down to embers, yet no one slept. They were deep inside enemy territory now, 3 days since insertion, and every rustle of the desert wind carried the possibility of betrayal. She sat slightly apart from the others, polishing the sight of her rifle with methodical patience. The motion was calm, but her chest was not. The others pretended not to notice her distance, pretended not to sense the storm brewing behind her quiet gaze, yet she knew. She could see it in the way Sergeant Cole stole quick glances at her, in the way Ramirez's jokes grew forced, falling into silence quicker than they used to. They thought she was fragile, worn thin. They saw the tremor that sometimes caught her breath when the silence grew too long. They saw weakness. But what they didn't know was that weakness had been her constant companion for years. Weakness was the mask she had learned to wear, because beneath it lived the truest courage she could muster, the courage to carry a burden no one else could see. The mission was simple on paper: infiltrate, observe, confirm, and if possible extract high-value intelligence. A ghost operation. No recognition, no headlines. Yet the deeper they pressed into hostile ground, the clearer it became that paper meant nothing. Locals watched them from behind shuttered doors. Tracks appeared on roads where no vehicle had passed. Radio silence grew too silent, too perfect. It was the kind of quiet that signaled eyes waiting in the dark. She laid her rifle down, let her fingertips brush against the cold sand. The desert whispered against her skin, a reminder of all the landscapes she had crossed in her service. Mountains, cities, jungles, yet always the same silence, always the same suspicion that the war wasn't out there, it was inside her. Cole broke the night first. "You don't have to sit alone." His voice was low, careful. He wasn't ordering her. He was reaching. She looked up at him, searching for something in his weathered face. He had lines carved by years of command, eyes that had seen enough death to harden most men. Yet in him tonight she saw something softer. She shook her head. "If I sit closer, you'll just hear me not talking." Cole exhaled a small laugh. It faded quickly. "You've been holding something back." The air grew tense. Even Ramirez, who pretended to be half asleep, tilted an ear toward them. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say it, to confess why her silence was heavier than theirs, to reveal the truth that every mile they marched was not just for the mission but for her sister, for the girl who had walked into the same uniform, the same desert, years before, and never walked out. But how could she speak that truth now, here, when they all needed focus, when one word might unravel the fragile thread keeping her steady? She swallowed it back. "We're all holding something back." Cole studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. He didn't press further. Maybe he understood, or maybe he just respected her silence. The wind shifted. Distant howls of dogs echoed across the dunes. A signal, perhaps, or maybe just animals fighting over scraps. No one could know for sure, but she felt her shoulders stiffen. Instinct. A soldier's intuition sharpened by loss. Ramirez broke the quiet. "You ever think about home, ma'am?" She glanced at him. His tone wasn't mocking, it was curious, almost boyish. He couldn't have been more than 22, too young to carry a rifle heavier than his regrets. "All the time," she admitted. "What's the first thing you'll do if we make it back?" She considered, not the easy answer, not the cliché. Finally, she whispered, "Sit in a room where no one needs me to be strong." Ramirez blinked at that. Maybe he had expected a joke, a drink, a family meal, but her answer hung in the night like a fragile truth. Cole broke it with a quiet command. Get some rest. Tomorrow we move before dawn. They obeyed, or at least they pretended to. But she lay awake, eyes on the stars. Every constellation seemed to form the same shape, the outline of her sister's face. A face she could barely remember now without dust and blood. The memory came uninvited. Her sister's laugh in the training yard, the way she had teased her, "You take everything too serious. You'll burn out before you even begin." But it was her sister who had burned out first, lost in a raid that was never fully explained. Official words said crossfire, but whispers told a different story. Friendly fire, a mistake buried by reports and medals. And so she carried the silence, because speaking it would mean opening a wound too deep to close. The next morning they moved. The dawn painted the desert in pale gold, but beauty meant nothing here. Every ridge, every shadow could conceal death. She led point, scanning, senses tuned to the smallest disturbance. They reached the ruins by noon, a skeletal compound long abandoned but still carrying traces of life. Ashes in corners, boot prints half hidden by dust. "This is it," Cole muttered. They settled in, establishing overwatch. Waiting, always waiting. Hours bled into one another. The desert heat pressed against their skin, sweat-soaking fabric, the taste of sand clinging to every breath. Then movement. Two men emerged from a side building carrying crates. She raised her rifle, sighting them through the scope. Too far for details, but close enough to confirm. Weapons. Illegal. Smuggled. Evidence they needed. She exhaled slowly, steadying her hands. She could end them now, but that wasn't the mission. Cole's voice crackled softly in her ear. "Hold fire, observe." She obeyed, though every instinct screamed otherwise. Hours later, more men arrived. Then vehicles. What had seemed like a minor hideout unfolded into a hub of operations. They were deep in the nest now, too deep. Ramirez whispered what they all thought. "If they find us." "They won't," Cole cut him off, but his voice lacked conviction. Night fell again. The compound below buzzed with movement, and she sat in the shadows, scope trained, eyes burning. Weakness, they thought. Fragility. But none of them knew how much strength it took to keep holding steady, to keep her finger off the trigger when vengeance whispered her name. Because one of those men, she was almost certain, had been part of the unit in the report, the one tied to her sister's death. She tightened her grip on the rifle, breath shallow, vision tunneling. And yet she did not fire. Not yet. The courage was in the restraint, the sacrifice was in the silence. But how long could silence hold before it shattered? Why was the darkness louder tonight than the gunfire that haunted her dreams? The ruins below hummed with enemy life, voices carrying through broken walls, engines coughing awake, laughter echoing too close to comfort. But it wasn't the sound of men that kept her awake. It was the silence in her own chest, the pressure of truths unspoken. She adjusted the rifle, cheek pressed to the stock, scope glinting faint moonlight. Her breathing slowed, but her thoughts did not. Cole shifted beside her. "Two more trucks since sundown," he whispered. "They're moving something big." She didn't answer. Her eyes tracked the compound gates where shadows flickered in and out. Every movement was logged, every pattern memorized. Yet her focus wasn't just tactical, it was personal. Because among those faces, she thought she recognized one. But could memory deceive her? Years of grief blurred details. Still, the way one man carried himself, the scar across his jawline, pulled her backward into the day everything had changed. The whispers of friendly fire, the silence of reports that didn't match the truth. Her hand trembled against the trigger. Weakness, the others would think. But it wasn't weakness. It was restraint. Restraint born from knowing vengeance could cost more than it gave. Ramirez crept closer, crouching low. His whisper broke the night. "Ma'am, if they mobilize, we'll be cut off." She glanced at him. His young face reflected fear, but beneath it something else. A need to trust, to believe she held answers. She wished she did. Cole's jaw tightened. "We wait. Command needs confirmation." That word wait burned. Waiting had killed her sister, waiting for orders that never came, waiting for backup that arrived too late. Waiting had been their undoing. She wanted to speak, to challenge, to break the silence that had been her shield for too long, but her throat locked, because what if they looked at her differently? What if they saw her not as a soldier but as a woman chasing ghosts? So she stayed quiet, watching, listening, waiting. Hours passed, the desert cooled, stars shifted overhead, and then movement, urgent, purposeful. Men carried sealed containers into the largest building. Guard rotations doubled. Lights stayed on where they had always gone dark before. Cole cursed under his breath. This isn't just a hub, it's a transfer point. And that meant something critical was passing through, something that could tip the balance far beyond this desert. Ramirez whispered, "We can't just sit here." His words echoed her thoughts, but command was silent, radios dead, maybe jammed, maybe worse. They were cut off, 5 soldiers in hostile territory, watching an enemy grow stronger by the hour. She adjusted her scope. Her eye locked on the scarred man again. Her pulse raced. Was it really him, the one tied to her sister's death? Her breath caught. She almost spoke his name aloud, almost confessed what haunted her, but she swallowed it, because admitting it meant risking the mission, risking trust. And right now, trust was their only weapon. Cole leaned closer, eyes open. If they move, we move. The night thickened. Sweat cooled against her spine, every sense sharpened, every heartbeat louder. She was no longer just watching the enemy, she was watching fate unfold. And yet somewhere deep inside, a question pressed against her silence. When the moment came, when choice finally demanded action, would she serve the mission or her own ghosts? The answer lingered unspoken in the desert air. How long could one night stretch before it broke? The ruins felt like a coffin now, stone walls pressing close, air growing thin. Every second she held her breath behind the rifle scope. Her lungs burned, not from lack of air but from the weight of silence. Silence had been her ally, her shield. But tonight, silence felt like betrayal. The compound below was alive. Men moved like restless shadows, trucks revving, crates shifting. Every few minutes, a flashlight swept the yard, beams cutting across the dust, forcing her squad lower into cover. She could feel the exhaustion in the others, muscles stiff, eyes strained, nerves frayed thin. But no one dared speak what they all knew. If they didn't act soon, they'd be swallowed whole. Cole crouched beside her, whispered low, almost a growl. "We're out of time. Command not coming through. We do this on our own." Her chest tightened. Those words had once meant freedom, autonomy, but here in this silence they felt like a curse. Alone, just like her sister had been. Ramirez shifted, whispering quick, nervous. "Sir, we can't go in blind. There's too many. We don't even know what's in those crates." She kept her eye to the scope, tracking the scarred man. He barked orders, moved with purpose, always guarded. If she leaned in just a little closer, she could almost hear his voice in her head. The same voice she remembered from fragments of overheard reports, whispers in mess halls, rumors traded in low tones. Was it him? The ghost who had written her sister's death into silence? Cole didn't answer Ramirez. Instead, he looked at her. Not with command, not with suspicion, with something heavier, expectation. "What do you see?" he asked. She inhaled. The question cut deeper than he knew. What did she see? The mission, the crates, the scarred man? Or did she see her sister lying in the dirt, uniform soaked with the cost of silence? "Movement patterns," she forced out. Her voice was steady, though her throat felt raw. "They're rotating guards on a 30-minute cycle. North wall's weakest, 2 men, minimal overlap." Cole nodded. "Then that's our way in." Ramirez cursed under his breath. "We're really doing this, just the 5 of us." "Just the 5 of us," Cole said. No further debate. Orders unspoken, yet carved into the air. They moved just before dawn, when the horizon was still a bruise of dark blue. The desert was colder now, biting against their skin, their breaths fogging faint in the air. She took point. Every step forward was heavier than the last, not because of the weight on her back, but because of the weight in her chest. The north wall loomed ahead. Crumbled stone, patches of rebar jutting out like jagged teeth. The guards were lazy, their rifles slung low, bored eyes scanning too casually. She signaled the others down, raised her rifle steady. One breath in, one slow exhale. The first guard dropped soundlessly. The second barely turned before a blade cut his throat. Silence again. But this silence was different, hotter, charged. Not the silence of restraint, but of aftermath. They slipped inside. The compound stank of oil and dust, sweat and steel. Corridors twisted through broken walls, graffiti smeared across stone like scars of old wars. Every corner threatened discovery. Every creak of a boot felt like thunder. Ramirez's breathing quickened. She could hear it even in the hush. He was too young for this, too human. She touched his shoulder as they crouched in shadow, a small gesture, but it steadied him. His eyes met hers, wide, grateful. For a moment she saw her sister in his face, not in the features but in the trust. Cole gestured forward. They advanced. Room by room they cleared. Empty bunks, stockpiled rations, and then the crates. Metal sealed, marked with foreign insignia. Weapons, explosives, documents, proof enough to bury nations in shame. Cole's jaw tightened. We need to record everything, photos, inventory. But she wasn't listening. Her eyes had locked on the scarred man. He was there in the center of it all, commanding, orchestrating. And when his face turned slightly, the light catching that scar, the truth seared through her. It was him. Her pulse roared in her ears. Every sound faded except the echo of her sister's laughter, her scream, the final silence that had followed. The man who had walked away from it. The man who had been protected by reports. Her hand gripped the rifle. The mission demanded silence, patience, intelligence gathering, but her heart demanded blood. Her finger slid to the trigger, breath slowing, target fixed. But then a hand on her arm, firm, grounding, Cole. His eyes met hers, steady, piercing. He didn't need words. The message was clear, not now, not like this. Her chest trembled. She wanted to scream, to break the silence that had become her prison, to tell them everything, to let them know why this wasn't just another mission, why every shadow in this compound carried the weight of her grief. But she said nothing. She let the rifle lower, just barely. Cole gave a single nod, then turned away, signaling the others. They set charges, not to destroy everything, just enough to send a message, to force panic, to scatter operations. The rest would be documented, transmitted if they ever found a signal again. When the first explosion tore through the compound, the silence shattered. Screams erupted, boots thundered, radios crackled in chaos. They moved like ghosts through the smoke, slipping out the same way they had entered. Ramirez stumbled once, fear choking him, but she grabbed his vest, yanked him steady. "Breathe," she hissed. Her voice was steel now, not silence. They ran, dust and fire behind them, the horizon bleeding into sunrise ahead. Each heartbeat was a drum, each step a prayer. When they finally collapsed behind a ridge miles from the ruins, gasping, drenched in sweat, silence returned. But this time it was a silence of survival, a silence earned. Cole looked at her, really looked. "You held back." She met his gaze. Her throat burned with the words she still didn't speak. About her sister, about the scarred man, about the ghosts that followed her. But she only nodded. Because sometimes silence wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was the hardest choice. And yet deep inside, she knew this silence wouldn't last forever. Because one day, she would have to break it. Why did the silence after fire always feel louder than the blasts themselves? The desert was quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was the hush of a hunted world, the kind of quiet that pressed on eardrums and made even a heartbeat sound like a signal flare. They had run until their legs trembled. Now they crouched in the shadow of a jagged ridge, the compound smoke still faint on the horizon. The mission was no longer covert. They were ghosts, yes, but ghosts with footprints, trails, heat signatures. The enemy would come. It was only a matter of when. Cole spread a map on the sand, his flashlight dimmed under his palm. His voice was steady, but weariness hid beneath it. We move west, 30 kilometers. There's a dried riverbed. We can hold there, regroup, find signal. No one argued. No one had the breath. Ramirez collapsed onto the ground, helmet tipped back, sweat streaking his face. 30 kilometers, he muttered, voice cracked. Might as well be 3,000. She sat beside him, silent, her rifle across her knees. The desert night was cold enough to bite, yet she still felt the heat of fire in her chest. The scarred man's face burned behind her eyes, sharper than ever. She had held back for the mission, for the team, but restraint had left a bruise in her soul. Cole folded the map. We move in 10, drink sparingly. She uncapped her canteen. The water was warm, metallic. She took one sip, then handed it to Ramirez. He blinked, surprised. You need it more, she said softly. His throat worked as he swallowed. He looked at her, wide-eyed, as if he wanted to ask why she cared, why she carried so much on shoulders already heavy. But he said nothing. Maybe he already knew the answer. The march west was agony. The desert floor stretched endless, rocks biting into boots, dunes rolling like a cruel sea. The sun clawed over the horizon, searing their backs, stealing moisture with every breath. Their shadows dragged long like specters tethered to the earth. Cole set the pace. Ramirez stumbled but kept going, his youth balanced by stubbornness. The others muttered little, each locked in their private hell of thirst and fatigue. She kept to the rear, eyes sweeping for threats, though her vision blurred at the edges. Heat shimmered. Distant shapes wavered. Mirage or enemy? No way to tell. She blinked, sweat away, every step heavier, every thought louder. Her sister's voice rose in the silence. You take everything too serious. One day, it'll eat you alive. But it hadn't eaten her alive. It had eaten her sister instead, and left her with the bones. By midday, they collapsed under a rock outcrop, shadows offering thin relief. Cole checked his compass. We'll reach the riverbed by nightfall. Keep it together. Ramirez pulled off his helmet, rubbing sweat from his brow. His lips cracked when he whispered, Sir, what if we do? The silence after that question was sharper than any bullet. Everyone knew what he meant. Supplies were low. Enemy was high. They were cut off, alone. What if this was as far as they went? Cole looked at him, not with anger but with a grim kind of honesty. Then we go down swinging. Ramirez's throat bobbed. He looked away, eyes glassy. She wanted to speak, to cut through the fear with something more than orders and grit, to share the truth, the real reason she pushed through silence, why she carried weight heavier than her pack. But the words locked tight. She had kept them buried for so long, she wasn't sure they could surface without breaking her. Instead, she said only, We'll make it. Her voice was firm, certain, more certain than she felt. They moved again, hours stretched, feet blistered, thirst gnawed. By late afternoon, the horizon finally broke, the riverbed. Dry, cracked earth carved between ridges offering cover. They descended, every muscle screaming, collapsed into shade. For the first time in days, a fragile sense of safety settled. Not peace, just a pause. Cole ordered rest. Ramirez drifted into shallow sleep, mumbling words that sounded like prayers. One of the others, Dawson, the medic, sat with his back to the wall, head tipped, whispering about home, about a daughter he hadn't seen in 2 years. His voice cracked when he said her name. The words pierced her. Everyone here carried ghosts. Everyone held silence of their own. As the sun sank, she cleaned her rifle, motions precise, mechanical. But inside, chaos churned. The scarred man was alive, commanding, untouchable. She had seen him. She had held him in her sights, and she had chosen silence. Cole sat across from her, watching. Finally, he spoke. You're holding something back. Her hand stilled. He leaned forward. I've seen it since the start. This isn't just a mission for you. Her breath caught, the silence around her thickened. Ramirez stirred faintly in sleep. Dawson's whispers faded. It was just Cole, his eyes steady, his voice low. You don't have to carry it alone, he said. Her throat burned. She wanted to tell him, to tell them all, that her sister had died because of men like the one they had just seen, that every step she took wasn't just for orders, it was for her, for vengeance, for justice twisted into silence. But the words stayed trapped. Her lips parted, then closed. Not yet, she whispered. Cole studied her, then he nodded as if he understood, or maybe as if he knew he couldn't push harder. Not now. Night fell, stars wheeled overhead. The desert cooled, but their bodies burned with exhaustion. She lay awake, staring at the sky. Her sister's face appeared in every constellation, her laughter in every whisper of wind. And in the silence, she asked herself the question that had no answer. Was restraint still courage, or was it cowardice now? Her heart pounded, because she knew the silence couldn't hold much longer. And when it broke, it would change everything. The night did not last. It never did. Out here, the hours slipped like sand through fingers, and dawn returned with no mercy. By the time the first light bled across the horizon, they were already moving again. Shoulders hunched, boots dragging, every man and woman a silhouette carved by suffering. The riverbed had given them shelter, but not salvation. Their supplies were gone, their bodies frayed, and the enemy was not far behind. Cole walked point, his eyes scanning every ridge. Ramirez stumbled near the middle, lips cracked white, his breath a rasp. Dawson lagged, whispering still about his daughter as though the words themselves tethered him to life. She walked at the rear, the desert stretching endless around her. Silence pressed against her ears. It was no longer relief. It was pressure building, aching. Then it came, the sound. Engines, distant but closing. The low growl of armored vehicles echoing across the dunes. Cole halted, fist raised. They found us. The squad froze, every heart beat faster, every breath shallower. And then voices. Over the horizon, through the heat shimmer, they appeared. Black trucks, dust plumes curling behind them, mounted guns glinting in the rising sun. The scarred man was coming. Her chest tightened. The moment she had both dreaded and longed for was here. Cole's voice was grim. We dig in here, no running left. No one argued. There was nowhere to go. They found cover among jagged rocks, rifles raised, shadows stretched long in the morning sun. The desert air was sharp with the smell of sand and oil. Ramirez's hand shook on his weapon. Sir, there's too many. Cole's voice was steel. Then we make every bullet count. She crouched low, breath steady, though her blood surged hot. She saw him, the scarred man standing in the back of the lead truck, a silhouette of power. His face, marred and cruel, caught the light. Her finger itched on the trigger. But silence held her again. That same silence that had saved her before, restrained her, chained her. Her sister's voice filled her head. Don't let hate swallow you. Don't let them own what's left of you. But hate burned. It was fire in her lungs, thunder in her heart. The trucks roared closer. The scarred man lifted a hand, commanding, calm, certain. And the world erupted. Bullets tore sand into clouds. The squad returned fire, muzzle flashes strobing in the dawn. The air screamed with ricochets, bodies ducking, shouting, bleeding. Ramirez fired wildly, panic in his eyes. Dawson grunted, pulling him down, pressing gauze to his own arm where a bullet had ripped flesh. Cole's voice cut through chaos. Hold the line. She sighted down her scope, eyes locked on the scarred man. The distance closed, she could end it. One pull, one shot. Her breath slowed, her finger tightened. But the silence screamed louder. She saw her sister's last smile, soft and defiant. She saw the fire that consumed her, the men who laughed as they left ruin behind. And she realized vengeance wasn't strength. Not here, Not anymore. Strength was silence, restraint, choosing when not to fire. She shifted. Instead of his head, she targeted the truck's engine. The shot cracked like thunder. The vehicle lurched, smoke spewing, the scarred man thrown sideways in shock. Cole glanced at her. Something like understanding flickered in his eyes. The battlefield shifted. Enemy soldiers scrambled, their advance broken. The squad pressed advantage, firing with precision, grit turning despair into defiance. But it wasn't enough. For every enemy that fell, two more rose. The squad was cornered, outnumbered, drowning in steel and sand. Cole's voice roared, "Fall back, behind the ridge." They scrambled, dragging the wounded, firing blind. She covered them, every shot deliberate, silence guiding her hand. Ramirez stumbled, a bullet grazing his shoulder. She caught him, pulled him behind cover, her grip steady. Then she saw him again, the scarred man. Alive, crawling from the wrecked truck, blood streaking his face but his eyes burning with hate. He raised a pistol, aiming straight at Ramirez. Time slowed. She had no choice. Her rifle rose, silence shattered, the shot rang eternal. The scarred man collapsed, dust swallowing him whole. Ramirez gasped, alive, staring at her with something between gratitude and fear. The battle raged on, but something inside her broke free. The silence was gone, not destroyed, but transformed. It wasn't a chain anymore. It was a weapon, a scream without sound. Hours blurred, bullets dwindled. The squad fought until their bodies gave out. And when reinforcements finally came, when the sky split with the roar of friendly aircraft, dust storms tearing enemy lines apart, they were still standing. Barely, but standing. The enemy scattered. The scarred man lay still in the sand, the desert claiming him. And she stood in silence, rifle heavy in her hands, her chest hollow but free. Cole approached, blood on his sleeve, exhaustion in his bones. He looked at her long, then nodded once. Not thanks, not praise, just acknowledgement. Ramirez sank to the ground, trembling, alive because of her. Dawson whispered his daughter's name, tears cutting through dust. The battle was over, but the war inside her still lingered. That night under the desert stars, she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, raw, breaking. "My sister, she died because of men like him." The squad was silent. No one interrupted, no one judged. She swallowed hard. "I thought if I carried it, if I stayed silent, maybe I'd keep her alive in me. But silence isn't just grief. It's strength. It's knowing when to hold back and when to let go." Her words hung in the air, fragile yet unbreakable. Ramirez bowed his head. Cole closed his eyes. Dawson smiled faintly through tears. And in that moment they understood. Her silence had carried them, not with shouts, not with rage, but with something deeper. When dawn came again, it found them battered, scarred, but unbroken. She stood alone on a ridge, watching the desert stretch endless. The wind whispered, the silence vast, eternal. And for the first time, she didn't fear it. Because silence was her voice, her scream, her strength. She didn't shout her strength. She let the silence around her scream it for eternity.